The Genesis planet has the distinction of being among the youngest...
Genesis allowed is not. Is planet forbidden.
Yeah, well, I'm already wanted by Starfleet, so what's it matter? As I was saying, the Genesis planet has the distinction of being among the youngest planets ever to be prominently featured in a science fiction film, as we literally watch it form in the closing scenes of Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. Given that the process of planetary formation usually takes tens of millions of years, it's clear that this planet was formed through artificial means. Indeed, the planet gets its name from the Genesis device, a mechanism clandestinely built by a team of scientists led by Dr. Carol Marcus and her son, Dr. David Marcus. The device was intended to provide a means of rapidly terraforming a planet for human habitation by reorganizing the planet's native surface matter at the subatomic level and transmuting it into life-generating matter, whatever that is. By design, the Genesis device was meant to be fired at a planet's surface, whereby upon impact it would emit a pulse of energy, the so-called Genesis wave, that spreads out over the entire surface of the planet, rapidly generating breathable atmospheric gases, water, arable soil, bacteria, vegetation, and even raising entire mountain ranges, apparently. However, this is not how the device was ultimately deployed. Instead, the planet that would come to bear the device's name coalesced directly from the collapse of the Mutara Nebula, following the malicious detonation of the Genesis device aboard the Federation starship USS Reliant. Indeed. Needless to say, this is not how planets typically form, and there are some that theorize that this is what led to the planet's ultimate fate, but more on that later. First, let's take a look at the Mutara Nebula itself. There are many types of nebulae in the universe, but unfortunately, Star Trek canon does not state to which type the Mutara Nebula belongs. And in light of the fact that Star Trek would later make the Mutara Nebula the prototype for similar Mutara-class nebulae, I'm guessing that they don't know either. But of course, I have some ideas. Most nebulae are enormous, spanning several hundred to a few thousand light-years across. But owing to their low particle density of just a few thousand atoms per cubic centimeter, you could be sitting in the heart of one of these behemoths and might not even know it. It would not be like driving through fog or flying through a cloud here on Earth, but this is how the Mutara Nebula appears. Its numerous wisps and cloudy structures visible as the USS Enterprise and USS Reliant circle one another within. Furthermore, both starships entered the nebula at sublight impulse speeds, and Captain Spock noted the moment that they crossed into it.
We are now entering the Mutara Nebula.
This suggests that the Mutara Nebula is rather compact and possesses a well-defined boundary, meaning it couldn't be a large molecular cloud and would need to be something much, much smaller, such as a Bok globule. Bok globules are dark, dense regions of ionized hydrogen gas that break off from larger molecular clouds as a result of star formation. They typically span less than 1 cubic light-year in volume and possess a mass anywhere from 2 to 50 times that of our Sun. Their density is due to the material within them being in a state of gravitational collapse, which will eventually result in the formation of a dozen or so stars. These properties do at least loosely match what we see in the film. These swirling rings of gas could represent the accretion of material onto a central object that has not yet reached the mass necessary for fusion ignition. These flashing lights could be the light of a newly formed protostar flickering through the envelope of rapidly spinning gas and dust that surrounds it. And the sensor interference experienced by both starships as they navigate the nebula could possibly be the result of its ionization. Though the lightning strikes seen in the film are not as realistic. Static electric discharges are not a feature of nebulae. The particle density is just too low, even in Bok globules. But I suppose they could just look like lightning, but instead be something like shock waves produced by intermittent nuclear fusion events as a nearby protostar oscillates prior to its ignition. But even that is a stretch. In any event, this nebula being a compact stellar nursery, like that of a Bok globule, goes a long way in explaining how there is already a star present once the Genesis planet has formed. And speaking of the planet's formation, this happens way too fast. As mentioned previously, normal planetary formation takes around 20 to 50 million years, but the Genesis planet is formed in what seems to be a matter of a few minutes. Of course, we can blame the Genesis device for this shortened time span, but such an accelerated formation would have profound consequences. Such a rapid accretion of mass would accelerate the planet's rotation, spinning it up to the point that it begins to flatten out due to centrifugal forces. This rate of rotation could even be high enough to form the planet into a synestia, a rapidly spinning donut-shaped mass of vaporized rock. Furthermore, the rapid accretion of mass would also generate enormous heat and pressure, possibly resulting in nuclear fusion taking place within the forming protoplanet. But even if it stops short of this extreme, it is still going to end up with a temperature of a few thousand degrees. So not only did the planet form excessively fast in the film, it also cooled excessively fast. And this feat isn't so easily blamed on the Genesis device. The rate at which a celestial object can shed its heat to space is controlled by a physical constant of the universe, specifically the so-called Stefan-Boltzmann constant. So the Genesis device would need to have altered a fundamental property of the universe, something I would consider to be a tall order, for it to cool its namesake planet in a matter of hours instead of a few million years. Turning our attention to the planet's surface, we find that it is a wet terrestrial possessing a similar atmospheric composition and pressure to that of Earth, as well as a comparable surface gravity. The most notable aspect of the planet is its so-called instability, that first manifests itself through the establishment of microbiomes, small regions of the planet's surface that experience vastly different temperatures, precipitations, humidity, barometric pressure, and wind speeds. At least I assume all these properties are different between the various biomes. They would kinda have to be, but the highly advanced computers aboard the dedicated science vessel USS Grissom only display the region's temperature, for some reason.
It's snow. Snow in the same sector. Fantastic.
Fascinating.
That's not quite the word I would use to describe it. I suppose that in a universe where giant space hands are a thing, this probably doesn't seem all that strange, but in our universe, this is rather absurd. A planet's climate is the result of how energy from its sun and water from its hydrosphere are moved around the planet by the gases in its atmosphere. This naturally establishes climate zones, air circulation patterns, and numerous other factors that dictate where the various biomes form. There are no natural phenomena that can alter all the necessary atmospheric properties over such short distances to produce the trail mix of random biomes seen in the film, where frozen tundra butt up against tropical jungles and deserts give way to swamplands.
This planet's aging in surges.
This is yet another symptom of the planet's instability, its reported rapid aging. Planets don't age in the same way as biological organisms do, so I'm not sure what Dr. Marcus is measuring. The primary indication of a planet's age is how much it has cooled since its formation. But if he is measuring its core temperature, why not instead say that it's cooling rapidly? You know, like an actual scientist. But whatever. This rapid cooling is consistent with what we saw earlier with the planet's formation, so there is that. As a planet cools, its interior begins to solidify from the outside inward. This causes its geomagnetic field to weaken, its volcanism to subside, and its plate tectonics to seize up. The planet also contracts slightly as it loses heat, which can cause the crust to fracture and buckle, resulting in seismic events not unlike the earthquakes seen in the film. However, as this rapid aging progresses, the planet eventually becomes superheated and its crust liquefies, which is the complete opposite of what it should do. However, there may yet be a way to explain this somewhat scientifically. The planet's instability is ultimately determined to be caused by the controversial use of a substance known as proto-matter in the matrix of the Genesis device.
Proto-matter. An unstable substance which every ethical scientist in the galaxy has denounced as dangerously unpredictable.
But it was the only way to solve certain problems.
As proto-matter is a purely fictional form of exotic matter, its properties and behaviors are entirely unknown. Dr. Marcus states that its inclusion was, quote, the only way to solve certain problems, end quote, but we are never told what those problems were and how proto-matter specifically solved them. However, we may have already come upon one, the planet's accelerated cooling. Heat is a form of energy, and energy cannot be created nor destroyed, only transferred from one place to another. This is the basis of thermodynamics. We have established that the planet's formation would have necessarily produced vast amounts of heat, and that this heat would need to be transferred away from the planet's surface as quickly as possible. After all, no one would be interested in a terraformation technology that requires thousands of years to dissipate the heat produced by the alteration process. But the planet cannot shed this heat through the usual means of electromagnetic radiation without incinerating everything on its surface. Enter proto-matter. It is theoretically possible that proto-matter has the capability of taking in energy from the surrounding environment, the planet's heat, and converting it to matter. This is consistent with special relativity, which famously expresses that matter and energy are manifestations of the same thing, and thus interchangeable. Matter can be turned into energy, and, importantly, energy can be turned into matter. It could be that those mountains seen rising in the wake of the Genesis wave are the result of the proto-matter converting residual heat into solid matter to effect cooling. Had the Genesis device been deployed onto a pre-existing planetary body as it was intended, this energy conversion effect may have been limited to the planet's surface and dissipated once the surface temperature dropped below a critical threshold. But since the Genesis planet instead accreted from the collapse of the Mutara Nebula, the energy conversion effect was able to propagate throughout the planet's entire mass, leading to the core's rapid cooling, or as Dr. Marcus stated it, its rapid aging. So how then does a planet in the process of cooling ultimately become superheated and blow itself apart? Antimatter. Anytime enough energy is consolidated to generate matter, it produces equal parts matter and antimatter. This antimatter is identical to its normal matter counterpart, only with a few quantum values flipped, such as its electric charge. If these matter and antimatter particles are brought back together, they annihilate and are both converted back into energy. Since generating large amounts of antimatter would essentially turn the planet into a giant bomb, it is reasonable to conclude that the proto-matter has some inhibiting force inherent to it that causes it to only produce normal matter. And though this might sound like more sci-fi magic, it's not actually as unrealistic as it might seem, as something very similar had to have happened when our universe formed to leave it comprised of mostly normal matter. But it could be that because the energy conversion effect has been propagating through the planet's interior and has thus continued for longer than anticipated, the proto-matter's reported instability is starting to manifest, resulting in the inhibiting force within the proto-matter decaying and allowing some quantity of antimatter to be generated. This antimatter then quickly annihilates with nearby normal matter, releasing large amounts of energy and creating a positive feedback loop, wherein the heat generated by the matter-antimatter annihilations feeds the energy conversion effect, which leads to more antimatter, which then leads to more heat, and so on and so forth until the planet is blown apart. Whereas this hypothesis is able to explain the planet's accelerated cooling after its formation, its rapid aging throughout the story, and its eventual fiery destruction, it is not able to explain the presence of assorted microclimates, nor how microbes are rapidly evolved but Spock is rapidly aged, or the reason why the plant life seems completely unaffected by these forces. Overall, I would give the Genesis planet a score of 5 out of 10, as it has equal parts plausible physics and science fiction nonsense. Thank you for joining me on this examination of the Genesis planet. If you enjoy learning about the science behind Star Trek planets, check out my breakdown of Spock's homeworld Vulcan, right here, or this, the homeworld of another founding member of the Federation, Andoria.